Hello, and welcome to the Lux Research webinar on the future role of green hydrogen. My name is Cord Eisenhagen, and I lead Lux Research's international business units across Europe, Middle East, Africa, and the Asia-Pacific regions. Our speaker today is Runeel Daliah, an analyst based out of our Singapore office. Runeel is a member of our energy research team at Lux, where he regularly advises our clients on issues related to innovations in biofuels, hydrogen, and CO2 capture and utilization. If during the course of Runeel's presentation today, you have any questions for him, the presentation, or about Lux Research in general, please type them in the Q&A box on the webinar platform, and at the end of the webinar, we'll get to as many of your questions as possible. Before we get started, I'd like to share just a few words about the challenges we are seeing in the oil and gas industry today, and how Lux Research helps companies like yours drive innovation and growth through these emerging technologies. These are a few of the unique innovation challenges that we see oil and gas companies trying to overcome in the near future. First, we see continued challenges in maintaining profitability and dividends in this constantly changing, highly volatile market. Second, we're finding that adapting to renewable energy sources while at the same time simultaneously supplying energy to the world requires a diversified approach to both investments and emerging technologies. And lastly, managing the rapid changes in automotive and maritime fuels industries combined with an asset base that is large and expensive makes response to these new technologies and markets very sluggish. So how do you find and foster new growth opportunities? Well, frankly speaking, it's complicated. If you're the head of innovation, strategy, product development, or corporate venture capital, many questions must be answered quickly so that you can define your strategic direction. For example, you must understand the market landscape and its key players. You need an in-depth understanding of the technical specifications of these new early-stage technologies, and you must clearly identify the opportunities and the risks associated with them. And that's really where Lux Research comes in. Companies today need to supercharge their growth strategies with the right data and insights to get at the who, what, and when of technology innovation. Lux provides expert curation of data developed via advanced analytics and domain knowledge from our technology experts to identify key market trends and indicators and what you should be doing about them. Lux is the leading provider of tech-enabled research and advisory solutions, helping our clients drive growth through technology innovation. As a demonstration of our approach, I'd like to pass things off to Runeel now, who will take us through a brief analysis on the future of green hydrogen and the opportunities for all of you in this space. Certainly, if you have any questions about Lux or what we do, ask them in the Q&A box or follow up with us directly after the webinar. So Runeel, I'll pass things over to you now.
Thank you, Cord. Hi, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Runeel Daliah, and I am an analyst covering energy technologies for Lux Research. Before we begin, I want to quickly provide an overview of how we cover the topic of hydrogen at Lux. Our energy transition program broadly tracks innovation and trends across the energy landscape. And at the high level, we define this transition as unfolding across 4 key themes, which you can see on your screens. And this webinar today focuses on hydrogen and sits within 2 of these themes: future energy sources for mobility, as well as carbon emissions management. And today we will look at hydrogen and where it fits within the wider energy transition. So hydrogen was discovered in the 17th century, and ever since then, people have been trying to find ways to use hydrogen. And you may not remember, because it was a very long time ago, but the first major application of hydrogen was actually in airships. The gas is light and was used to transport heavy goods and people over long distances. But that was not a very successful application of hydrogen, because when the Hindenburg disaster happened, that was pretty much the end of hydrogen in airships. But around the same time, another application of hydrogen emerged, and that was in industrial chemistry. In the 20th century, Germany did not have access to nitrates and ammonia because of the war. So the two German scientists, Haber and Bosch, developed the Haber-Bosch process so that Germany could produce its own ammonia from hydrogen. And that application was a tremendous success. As you can see from the graph, today, almost half of the entire world's population was supported on food that was grown using nitrogen-based fertilizers. And even today, this Haber-Bosch process is pretty much the only process used to produce fertilizers around the world. So you can see a pattern emerging here. When a problem emerges, hydrogen is brought forward as a solution. And sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. So hydrogen was very successful in industrial chemistry, but that was a long time ago. So let's jump forward and look at some of the new problems that it's trying to solve. What about the problem of energy security? Back in the early 1970s, the OPEC announced an oil embargo against the US, which crippled the country and brought to light the issue of energy security. What can you do when your main energy supplier decides to cut you off? Well, you can start by producing your own energy, so you don't ever have to rely on someone else. And this is when the concept of a hydrogen economy started to pick up. So why was hydrogen even brought forward as a solution to this problem of energy security? On paper, it makes perfect sense to replace diesel and gasoline with hydrogen because you can produce the hydrogen locally, which means you don't depend on anyone else for energy. You only need electricity and water. And then hydrogen burns clean, which means you have no emissions at all, whether it's CO2, nitrogen, or sulfur emissions. And finally, hydrogen has a high energy density, which means that you can not only use it in cars, but also in trucks and eventually in ships and airplanes as well. And this is why interest in hydrogen as a transportation fuel has shot up over the years. The engine of a hydrogen economy is the fuel cell. And as you can see from our LuxTech signal, which tracks innovation interest in a particular technology, innovation interest in the fuel cell experienced very rapid growth in the early 2000s, as many automakers around the world were rushing to be the first one to launch a fuel cell vehicle. So at the time, hydrogen was very popular. But then cracks started to appear in this hydrogen economy. Even though the fuel cell vehicle was launched commercially, we quickly realized that we weren't producing enough hydrogen to support the widespread deployment of these fuel cell vehicles. And even if we were producing enough hydrogen, there was no way to get it to the customer because there was no hydrogen infrastructure for distribution. And building this infrastructure, as you can imagine, would take a very long time. And because of all of these problems, customers quickly lost interest in the fuel cell car because what is the point of having a hydrogen car if you can't even get hydrogen in the first place? And this is why innovation interest in fuel cell technology has constantly decreased since 2006 when the innovation interest peaked. And even today, innovation interest continues to drop. And then, as if that wasn't enough, hydrogen received a crushing blow from the electric car. As you can see in the figure, back in 2011, electric vehicles and fuel cell vehicles were pretty much head-to-head in terms of sales. But over the past 10 years, the sale of EVs have continued to increase, while fuel cell vehicles still struggle to gain adoption. Now, looking at these sales figures and the trends in the industry, I think we can all agree that for passenger cars at least, electricity has won the race against hydrogen. So does that mean that no one cares about hydrogen anymore? Well, no, a lot of people still do. And for example, in 2017, the Hydrogen Council was formed to promote the adoption of hydrogen around the world. And look at all of these companies that are in the council. You have automakers as expected, but this time you also have oil and gas majors, chemicals majors, and so on. So why did all these companies decide to come together and work on hydrogen, despite the fact that the hydrogen economy has pretty much failed? This is because in 2015, something happened that brought hydrogen back into the conversation. In 2015, we had the Conference of Parties for the Paris Agreement, where countries around the world gathered and agreed that we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by any means possible. And with this, hydrogen has found a fresh new problem for it to solve. And that problem is limiting global temperature rise to less than 2 degrees Celsius. And that problem is the largest that hydrogen ever had to tackle, because not only is it a global problem, but it spans across all sectors, which means that there is no one-size-fits-all solution here. But hydrogen is not the only one trying to solve this emission problem. There are a lot of other technologies out there that are trying to do so. So really the key here is identifying which sector presents the biggest opportunity for hydrogen. It won't be in power generation. Over there, you already have solar and wind energy taking the lead. It also won't be in transportation, not with the electric car. And it won't be in buildings as well, because you already have heat pumps and district heating has options. But what about the industrial sector? The industrial sector is a big emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. And here, the pathway to decarbonization is less clear. Until the Paris Agreement, the industrial sector was largely immune to regulatory pressure on their emissions. And they still mostly are today, but it's very clear that we will not reach the target of the Paris Agreement unless we also reduce emissions from industry. And because this is a new problem, there is still no clear winner. And here, there is still potential for hydrogen to have a significant impact. So let's look at the emission problem in industry in more details. The emission problem in industry can be split into two. The first problem is heat. The industrial sector consumes a large amount of heat to run its operation, and that heat comes from combustion of natural gas or coal. So how can you use hydrogen to solve this problem? Well, you simply replace natural gas and coal with hydrogen combustion. But you can also replace natural gas and coal with biomethane or biocoal. Or you can simply bypass combustion altogether and use industrial heat pumps. Or if you just do not want to move away from combustion, you can just build a carbon capture unit in your facility to capture all of your emissions. So here, is hydrogen the right solution here? Today, 75% of energy is used as heat in industry comes in the form of low to medium temperature steam. So if you want to start decarbonizing the sector, you start with low temperature steam. And in this case, biomass and heat pumps will likely be used first. So for the heat problem in industry, hydrogen only becomes relevant for high temperature processes only. The second problem facing the industry is the feedstock problem. The chemicals and refining industry uses a lot of hydrogen as a feedstock for their products. And all of that hydrogen today pretty much comes from natural gas. Now, natural gas is a fossil fuel, and if you want to go green, you would have to find something else. And that something else is green hydrogen. You're still using hydrogen, but instead of it coming from natural gas, you produce it from water electrolysis that is powered from renewable electricity. But what about the other competing solutions to this problem? Well, there isn't any, because this problem is very unique in the sense that you just cannot replace hydrogen with something else. And this makes it the perfect problem for hydrogen to solve, because here, hydrogen itself is the problem. Or rather, the source of hydrogen is, and because you cannot replace hydrogen with anything else, then your only solution is to use green hydrogen. So now the question is, how easy is it to replace fossil hydrogen with green hydrogen? Now, before we answer this question, let's take a look at where hydrogen is used in industry today. The majority of hydrogen today is used in chemicals and refinings, with some also used in metal working. Now, within the chemical sector, ammonia and methanol are the two main products made from hydrogen. So for the sake of today's webinar, we'll take a closer look at how we can integrate green hydrogen into methanol production. So today, methanol is produced from natural gas. Hydrogen in this case comes from reforming of natural gas and is then used to produce methanol by combining it with carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. So this is the incumbent process for methanol production. And if you want to use green hydrogen from electrolysis, you replace the steam reformer with an electrolyzer. But that only gives you hydrogen, and you still need a source of carbon. And since you want to produce green methanol, you want low or zero emission carbon, the simplest option being CO2 from carbon capture. So you have your fossil-based hydrogen process and your green hydrogen process for methanol. Obviously, using the green hydrogen process is more expensive because if it wasn't, everyone would be using it today. So how do you force people to move from cheap but dirty methanol to green but a more expensive one? You simply use carbon taxes. Producing methanol from natural gas results in CO2 emissions, whereas the green pathway is a carbon negative pathway since you're using CO2. So if you start penalizing people for emitting CO2, then they won't want to produce CO2 anymore. Which now brings us to the question, how high do carbon taxes have to be such that green hydrogen is cost competitive with fossil hydrogen for methanol production? And the answer is here on this graph. The biggest cost variable and barrier for electrolysis today is the price of electricity. So in our analysis, we looked at the relationship between carbon taxes and electricity prices for methanol production using green hydrogen. So let's say today you have electricity at a cost of $100 per megawatt hour. Now you would need a carbon tax of $600 per ton of CO2 to be cost competitive. And as the price of electricity goes down, so does the carbon tax requirement. Now, the price of industrial electricity varies in different countries, but $100 per megawatt hour is a good estimate for an average. And clearly, at that price point, you would never be able to make green methanol because it's just too expensive. So what can you do? Well, you could develop more efficient electrolyzers. If you increase the efficiency of electrolysis, you'll be moving the line to the right, which means that you require a lower carbon tax for the same price of electricity. But today, electrolyzers are as efficient as they can be. And even if you increase the efficiency of electrolysis by 3, 5, 10%, which would be a great achievement, but very challenging, it still won't have a big impact. So relying on more efficient electrolyzers is just unrealistic. Your second option is to wait for carbon taxes to go up. Today, carbon taxes around the world are anywhere between $5 to $50 per ton of CO2, and they keep on increasing. But how long will it take till we reach $600 per ton of CO2? It's very challenging to implement or raise a carbon tax in many countries around the world, which is why if you wait for governments to do that, you'd be waiting a very long time. So this option is also unrealistic. Which leaves us with our third and last option, which is simply to find a source of cheap electricity. Because if you have cheap electricity, then you would need a lower carbon tax to offset your costs. And remember, you want to produce green hydrogen, so that electricity has to be renewable. So is it possible today to find cheap renewable electricity? Well, it is. The figure here shows the levelized cost of electricity production from solar and wind over the past 10 years. And you can see that the cost of renewable electricity production has dropped a lot over the years. Back in 2010, it would cost you $300 to produce 1 megawatt hour of solar. And today, it's only $50. So we can already produce renewable electricity at a cost lower than $100 per megawatt hour. The question is, where can we find this cheap renewable electricity? Well, we can all go to Saudi Arabia, for example. Last year, EDF Renewables and Mazda won the contract to build a 400 megawatt wind farm in Saudi Arabia. And this project will be selling electricity to the power company at a price of just $21 per megawatt hour, which is extremely cheap. Now, there are likely subsidies involved here, but it shows you that cheap renewable electricity is already a reality today, or it will be once EDF and Mazda build that plant. So let's say, for example, that Mazda and EDF decided to produce methanol using electricity from this project, then they would only need a carbon tax of $100 per ton of CO2. It's still a high carbon tax, but it's not so unrealistic if you are serious about cutting down our emissions. So when it comes to green hydrogen, relying on getting cheap electricity is actually a realistic option. So remember how earlier we said that hydrogen is a solution looking for a problem to solve? Well, hydrogen has found its new problem, and that problem is decarbonizing industrial feedstock. But this is not something that will happen now. It will take a long time for us to get there, for us to get a large amount of cheap electricity together with high carbon taxes, which are the two things that you need before deploying green hydrogen in industry. But as you wait, here are some of the things that you can already start doing. The first one is to simply look at the immediate opportunities for hydrogen. It will take a while for hydrogen to gain traction in industry, but there's already opportunity for new hydrogen applications in other sectors, like the industrial mobility sector, for example. Another thing you can start doing now is looking into hydrogen storage and carrier technologies. Because if the demand for green hydrogen picks up, and we presume that it will, then someone somewhere will have to produce lots of it and send it to the customer. So that person would need a reliable option for hydrogen carriers. And finally, vision and collaboration are very important. You should not repeat the mistakes of the fuel cell car industry, where back then automakers were rushing to be the first one to launch a fuel cell car, and once they did, they realized that there was no infrastructure. If you're intent on using hydrogen for whichever application, whether it's industry, mobility, or energy storage, then you need to work with your peers and especially with governments to develop a roadmap for hydrogen, because this will be a collaborative effort. The Hydrogen Council is a really great step in this direction, and if we keep that up, then hydrogen will have a really good chance at succeeding. Thank you.
Thank you, Runeel. That was a fantastic presentation and incredibly informative. For those of you dialed into the webinar today, if you do have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box on the webinar platform, and we will get to as many questions as we have time for today. We've got a bunch coming in, so let's dive right into the Q&A session now. Runeel, here's the first question, and I'll paraphrase it a little bit. You spoke a lot about hydrogen applications in industry, but you also mentioned that there are smaller opportunities in other segments and other sectors as well. Maybe you could elaborate on some of these other opportunities that you're seeing in the market today.
Yes, of course. So in transportation, it's all about identifying applications where you cannot use electricity. And for that, you need to rely on the two big advantages of hydrogen. First, it has a high energy density, which means that you can use it to travel over long distances. And it's a gas, so when you have to stop for refueling, it's a very quick process. And vehicles like those used in industrial mobility, like forklifts, but also heavy-duty trucks for commercial transport, train, airplanes, ships. These are the type of vehicles where you cannot waste time refueling because they're assets, and every second that you waste by keeping them idle, you're losing money. So this is where hydrogen will have an impact in transportation. It has already started with forklifts, trains, and buses, and we will start to see commercial deployment soon. And the advantage with these is that you're bypassing the hydrogen distribution problem that you had with fuel cell cars. Because if, say, for example, you have your own fleet of fuel cell buses, then you will be building your own fueling station to service your own fleet. So you won't have to rely on someone else to build that network for you. Then there's also the building sector as well. A lot of cities are using natural gas for heating, and you can electrify the heating sector by using heat pumps. The technology for residential heat pumps today is quite good, and that would be the logical solution. But what about the natural gas infrastructure that you already have there? You spent a lot of money building it, and you're not just going to stop using it. That would be a waste of money. So what you should do is inject hydrogen into it. You can already inject hydrogen in natural gas pipelines up to a certain level. There's currently a trial in the steel Leeds in the UK where they're planning to inject up to 20% hydrogen into that pipeline without making any modification. So it's not a full conversion, but when you think of the amount of natural gas consumed for heating, 20% is quite a lot of hydrogen. And then finally, there's the power generation sector. The focus there is still very much on increasing penetration of renewable electricity onto the grid, but you will eventually reach a point where you have so much excess renewable electricity that you need to find a way to store all of that energy for a long time. And hydrogen there is a good solution for storing large amounts of energy for a long time. So all of these opportunities exist already in other sectors, and there are already companies, cities, and countries out there that are trying to make it work.
Thank you, Runeel. I think we probably have time for one more question, unfortunately, and we can take the rest offline. This question is around timeline. You mentioned that it will take a long time for us to see industrial applications of hydrogen. In your opinion, what could really accelerate this transition? Could you spend a few minutes on that?
Yes, of course. So I believe that regulations is still the biggest barrier for a hydrogen transition. At the end of the day, hydrogen applications, whether it's in mobility or in industry or heating, it will always be more expensive than fossil fuel. And that does not mean that we shouldn't move away from fossil fuel, because we should try, but we need help to do so. And carbon taxes, as they are today, they're just too broad to help. For example, carbon taxes do nothing for the transportation sector and very little for the chemical sector, where hydrogen is used as a feedstock. So instead, you need a targeted approach for each sector. And a good example of one in transportation is what the state of California is doing with the low carbon fuel standard system. That system looks at the carbon intensity of a fuel and then allocate credits based on that. And it doesn't care what the fuel is, whether it's natural gas, electricity, or hydrogen. It only looks at the carbon intensity. And if you want to have incentives if you want to incentivize adoption of green hydrogen in the industrial sector, then you need a similar system that looks at carbon footprint of the chemical produced. So once you have that in place, then every component of the manufacturing process, from the feedstock to the energy source, will be under scrutiny. And if you have that, then you naturally incentivize adoption of green hydrogen in industry. But on the flip side, you're also promoting other competing technologies, but that's just the way it should be. You should never have a system in place to promote only one kind of technology, because then you end up in a situation where it's very hard to move away once a better and cheaper technology or solution comes along.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Runeel. I think we have run out of time, unfortunately, to address the other questions online. But thanks again for a wonderful presentation and answering some of those questions from our webinar participants today. While we weren't able to get to everyone's question, if you did submit one or still want to, email us directly and we'll get back to you as soon as we can for follow-up. We will be sending out the presentation material and recording to everyone who's attended today. And you can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter and our blog for ongoing information and analyst insights. Thanks for your attention, and thanks again to our presenter, Runeel Daliah, and have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.